Hey everyone, it's Justin here, America's Honest Tax Accountant from Number Crunch Nerds. Today's video is all about surviving spouse RMD options. And this is an issue that everyone who is married and has IRAs in the family will have to deal with at some point. So it's important to understand your options so that we can prepare our tax plans and projections for the future appropriately. There are also some new options to consider under Secure 2.0, and these options are nuanced. So if you've been having trouble understanding the differences between number one, what the options are in the first place, and perhaps more importantly, number two, when each option would be the most appropriate choice, I completely understand the struggle. That's why in this video series we're going to break it down step by step so you can understand the minor differences between each option and be able to determine the most appropriate choice based on your facts and circumstances. Now, if you recall, we first saw the chart above right here in Roth IRA conversion video series number 9. And I said that we would spend some time talking about the section of the chart that relates to the time period between the passing of spouse 1 and spouse 2. So basically, we're talking about this time period right here. In today's video, we are not going to focus so much on widow's penalty. What is widow's penalty again? It's the additional tax that surviving spouse will be subject to on your combined RMD income due simply to the fact that she or he will be in the single filer tax brackets instead of the married filing joint tax brackets, assuming they don't remarry. And widow's penalty is generally an important reason to accelerate those Roth conversions to the extent that you can and get them into the married filing joint tax brackets. And as many of you know, we deal with that issue directly inside of the personal tax planning template as part of our Roth IRA conversion planning. So today we are going to focus on the rules themselves that determine two things. Number one, the rules determine when RMDs will have to start for surviving spouse. And number two, the rules determine how much will the RMDs be in the year that they begin. So we're going to start right here with the original rules that were in place prior to 2024. These rules are still applicable today. These rules did not go away. Secure 2.0 simply added even more options to what was already there. So we're going to start right here, and then we're going to layer on additional rules as we go along. So basically, under the original rules, the surviving spouse had two general options. Option one was to treat the IRA as an inherited IRA. This means that the IRA would remain titled in the deceased spouse's name, and therefore surviving spouse would basically be a beneficiary of this IRA. We're going to call this option one the default option because no action is required on the part of surviving spouse for this to happen right here. Basically, this is the treatment that you would get if surviving spouse took no action. Now, the second option was to do a rollover IRA. In this case, the IRA becomes titled in the surviving spouse's name. Basically, under this option, the IRA is treated as belonging to surviving spouse the whole time. And we're going to call this option 2 the rollover option. So just to summarize the high-level differences we've encountered so far, over here in option 1, the surviving spouse is basically a beneficiary of this IRA. And over here in option 2, surviving spouse becomes the original owner of the IRA. Okay, now there are two distinct situations that we are going to look at to which the options above that we just went over can apply. The first one I'm going to refer to as pre-RBD, and that would mean that the deceased spouse passes before their required beginning date. And the second one I'm going to call post RBD, and that would mean that the deceased spouse passes after their required beginning date. So let's review that real quick. RBD, or required beginning date, is April the 1st of the year after the year when you turn 73, or note that it would be after 75 starting in 2033, which is the year when the RMD start date changes from 73 to 75. Also note that RBD is only an applicable thing. It's only an applicable term in the first year you're supposed to start your RMDs. Basically, it's like a little extra time to take your first distribution, and then after that, distributions need to happen by 12/31 of whatever the current year is. So for example, looking at this chart, you're supposed to start your RMDs when you turn 73, but for that first year when you turn 73, they'll give you a little extra time until April 1st of the year after that to actually take the first distribution. And then, as I said, after that, you just have to take the distributions by 12/31 of the current year. Okay, now just to summarize the takeaway that I want you to have from these two graphics right here before we continue, is that the common language that you will hear when you read or learn about this topic will refer to the deceased spouse either passing pre or post their RBD. In the examples we're going to go through in this video, I'm going to say that spouse 1 is the deceased spouse. So if spouse 1 would have been 73 years old right here and the RBD is right here, but spouse 1 actually passed over here, then spouse 1 has passed pre-RBD. Alternatively, if spouse 1 had already turned 73 and their RBD was here, they would have already started taking their RMDs. And so if their year of passing was over here, then they would have passed post-RBD. And that distinction between passing pre-RBD and passing post-RBD will be relevant to the decision that surviving spouse has to make regarding the treatment of the IRA, and it can impact when the RMDs will start as well as the amount of the RMD once it begins. So with that foundation in place, let's jump into some examples. Okay, let's start with scenario 1. Now, there's a lot of information on this screen, but you will find it's relatively straightforward as we walk through it from left to right. So in this scenario, deceased spouse passes before their RBD, and surviving spouse is going to be older than deceased spouse. So starting right over here, spouse 1 is 55 years old in 2025, and they are the original IRA owner. Also in 2025 down here, spouse 2 is going to be 60 years old. Now right here in 2030, spouse 1 passes at 60 years old. In the same year down here, spouse 2 is now 65 years old, and we're going to say for this scenario that option 1, the default option, the inherited IRA option, is what is going to apply. So right here under option 1, RMDs start when the deceased spouse would have reached RMD age. I want to note right here that based on the ages in this example, we're going to cross 2033 right here before spouse 1 would have reached the RMD age. Therefore, the RMD age will change from 73 to 75 for this example. So if we look back here one more time, spouse 1 was 55 years old in 2025. Therefore, spouse 1 would have reached age 75 in 2045, 20 years later. And so 2045 is the year when RMDs would start out of the inherited IRA for surviving spouse. Surviving spouse calculates their RMD based on Table 1, which is the beneficiary table that we will cover in a moment. The calculation is based on their own age. In this case, spouse 2 is 80 years old in 2045. So one more time, the RMD calculation is based on surviving spouse's age, and the RMD starts in the year when deceased spouse would have reached RMD age. So if we hop over here to Table 1, this comes from IRS Publication 590B. This is called the Single Life or Beneficiary Table. What we do here is we just go down to the age of spouse 2, the surviving spouse in the relevant year. So we said spouse 2 was going to be 80 years old. We find the relevant factor right here, 11.2 in this example. And so we're going to bring that back over here to the RMD calculation. For all of these examples, I'm just going to use the simplifying assumption that the IRA value at the time when RMDs start is going to be $1 million. So we take the Table 1 factor of 11.2 and we divide 1 million by 11.2 and we get the RMD for the first year, which in this case is $89,286. Okay, scenario number 2. Now the only difference between scenario 2 and the previous scenario 1 is that this time surviving spouse is going to be younger than deceased spouse. So spouse 1 is 55 years old in the starting year, that is the same. Spouse 1 passes at 60 in 2030, that is the same. This time spouse 2 is 50 years old, so 5 years younger than spouse 1. Spouse 2 is 55 years old right here in 2030, the year of passing. Option 1, the default inherited IRA option, is going to apply here. Same as before, under option 1, RMDs start when the deceased spouse would have reached RMD age. So in this example, that is the same year, 2045. So surviving spouse calculates the RMD based on their own age again. This time, surviving spouse is going to be 70 years old. So we go to Table 1, we go to the relevant age of 70 years old. We see that the factor is 18.8. We go back to the RMD calculation, $1 million IRA value. There's the 18.8. The RMD for the first year is $53,191. So let's compare the difference. In scenario 1 right here, the RMD started in 2045, and because it's based on the age of spouse 2 when it starts, and spouse 2 is older in scenario 1 than in scenario 2, the RMD is larger at 89,286. In scenario number 2 right here, everything is the same except for the fact that spouse 2 is 70 years old in the year when the RMDs start, which is still 2045. Therefore, the Table 1 factor is 18.8 and the first year RMD is 53,191. Okay, now scenario number 3. Here, everything is going to be the same as scenario number 1, except for the fact that this time we're going to do a rollover of the IRA instead of going with the default option, which is the inherited IRA. So right here, deceased spouse is going to pass before the RBD. That is the same. Surviving spouse is older. That is the same as scenario 1. So spouse 1 is 55 right here, and spouse 2 is 60. Spouse 1 passes at 60 years old in the year 2030. Spouse 2, who is now 65 years old, goes with option 2 and rolls over the IRA. So now spouse 2 is treated as the original IRA owner. Spouse 2 is no longer a beneficiary. When spouse 2 is treated as the original owner of the IRA, then all of the information relevant to RMD start date and the relevant age and factor, all of it relates to spouse 2 this time. This has now become spouse 2's IRA. So once we go that route, the age of the deceased spouse no longer matters once you go to option 2, the rollover option. So now that this IRA belongs to spouse 2, what is the RMD starting age? And the answer is it's going to be the year when surviving spouse turns 75, the year that RMDs are going to start. Again, that is because we have gone beyond the year of 2033 for this example. So spouse 2 is 65 right here in 2030, the year of spouse 1's passing. Therefore, 10 years later, they will be 75. Surviving spouse calculates the RMD based on table 3 this time, which is the uniform lifetime table, and the RMD is based on their own age in the year when they, surviving spouse, reached the RMD age. So if we go to table 3 right here, again, this comes out of IRS publication 590B. This is the uniform lifetime table. This is the same table that you use right now to calculate your own RMDs, and that should make sense because this IRA now belongs to spouse 2. And so therefore spouse 2 would use this table to calculate their own RMDs. In this case, spouse 2 is starting RMDs at 75, therefore the factor is 24.6. We go back over here to the RMD calculation. There's the same IRA value at $1 million. There is our table 3 factor of 24.6, and there is our RMD calculation for the first year, $40,650. All right, now going to scenario number 4. This is going to be the same fact pattern as scenario number 2 right over here. Deceased spouse passes before their RBD and surviving spouse is younger. Now for this analysis, let's just summarize this entire top section right here with this one sentence. The age of the deceased spouse no longer matters if you go to option 2, the rollover option. We just learned that in the previous scenario. So for purposes of scenario 4, this entire top section doesn't matter anymore. In the rollover option, all we need to do is look at the information for spouse 2 because spouse 2 is now treated as the original owner of the IRA. So in scenario 4, spouse 2 is 50 years old in 2025. Spouse 2 is 55 years old in 2030, the year of the rollover. And so when do RMDs start under the rollover option? And the answer is when surviving spouse, now the original owner of the IRA, reaches the RMD age, which in this case is going to be 75 because it's happening after 2033. And spouse 2 is 50 years old in 2025. That would make them 75 in 2050. Now, before we go to table 3 to look up the factor, what is the same and what is different about this right here versus scenario 3 over here? Well, if we go back to scenario 3, the RMDs still start at age 75 for surviving spouse. The only difference is the year when they start, 2040 versus 2050 over here in scenario 4. But because the factor is based on surviving spouse's age when the RMDs start, the table 3 factor is going to be the same, 24.6, which is the factor relevant to a person who is starting RMDs at age 75. So the first year RMD in scenario 4 of $40,650 is going to be the same as the RMD in scenario 3. The only difference is the year when RMDs begin due to the age of surviving spouse. Now, in looking at everything that we have gone over so far and knowing that you have a choice as surviving spouse to either leave the IRA as an inherited IRA, the default option, or you can roll the IRA over and have it treated as your own IRA. So the question is, which choice generally produces the most favorable answer? Let's compare scenario 4 to scenario 2. So back over here in scenario 2, where spouse 2 started at 50 years old in 2025, RMDs started at age 70, and the first year RMD amount was $53,191. Over here in scenario 4, where spouse 2 also started at 50 in 2025, RMDs under the rollover option started 10 years later in 2050, and the first year amount was lower at $40,650 versus about $53,000 that we saw over here in example 2. So generally speaking, the result that makes the RMDs start at the latest possible date and also makes the RMDs start at the smallest possible amount is usually going to be the more favorable option. However, let's think about this example just a little bit further. In the year when spouse 1 passes right here, spouse 2 is only 55 years old. So if spouse 2 at 55 years old rolls over this IRA and makes it their own IRA, then if they were going to take distributions from it between the age of 55 and 59 and a half, what would happen? Well, they would be subject to the 10% early distribution penalty on distributions that are now coming out of their own IRA. So if spouse 2 right here, who is 55 years old, needs some of the money from the traditional IRA for living expenses, for example, then just choosing to roll over the IRA at 55 because you look out here and say, hey, that RMD is lower and it also starts later, that could be a choice made without considering all the relevant facts. On the other hand, if we go back to scenario 2, if the IRA remains as an inherited IRA, then spouse 2 can take distributions from the inherited IRA without incurring the 10% penalty. And in this particular fact pattern, because the RMDs don't actually start until way out here, spouse 2 could leave the IRA as an inherited IRA up until, let's say, age 59 and a half or 60, and then spouse 2 could choose to roll over the IRA at that time once they pass the 59 and a half age threshold. There's no time limit on your ability to roll over the IRA and make it your own. So a strategy that you want to have in mind, particularly if you are a younger surviving spouse, younger than 59 and a half, you want to consider your monetary needs, and you probably want to consider leaving this as an inherited IRA until you cross 59 and a half. Now going over here to compare scenario 3 back to scenario 1, this is the situation where spouse 2 was older than spouse 1 and spouse 2 is already over the age of 59 and a half when spouse 1 passes. So here in scenario 3, RMDs start in 2040 and the amount is about $40,000. If we go back to example 1 right here, you can see that the RMDs are actually pushed out 5 years longer based on the age when spouse 1 would have reached age 75. So in this case, spouse 2 will be starting the RMDs at 80 years old instead of 75, but the amount of the first year RMD is going to be about double at $89,000 versus about $40,000. So as I've said many times on the channel, there is no right or wrong answer. Neither one of these is better. They're only better based on your facts and circumstances. And that is the reason why we lay out our numbers in the personal tax planning template and we figure out, would it be better to start the RMDs 5 years later even though the amount is more? Or back over here in scenario 3, would it be better to start the RMDs 5 years earlier and have a lower amount? Generally speaking, people find that it's more beneficial to actually go with this scenario, having the RMDs start a little bit earlier because they get the benefit of the amount being significantly less. But that's not to say that the other way couldn't be more beneficial in a different fact pattern. So again, the point here is not to say that one is better than the other. The point is to lay out the options, show you how to calculate your options, and then within within the context of your broader tax planning, you can determine which one is better for your situation. By the way, if you are concerned about the impact that RMD income is going to have on you in retirement, and you want to proactively minimize the RMD burden on your family, then make sure to check out my currently 10-part Roth IRA conversion video series on YouTube, where you will learn in detail about how to minimize your taxes and maximize your after-tax cash flow using the Roth IRA conversion strategy. You can find a link to part 1 of that video series in the description below this video, or just search on YouTube for Number Crunch Nerds Roth IRA conversions. Alright, so in this video, Surviving Spouse RMDs Part 1, we covered the basics of the default option and the rollover option when the deceased spouse passes before their RBD. In Part 2 of this series, we're going to look at the default option and the rollover option when the deceased spouse passes after their RBD. Then in Part 3 of this series, we're going to look at the new spousal election under Secure 2.0 that allows the surviving spouse to be treated as the deceased spouse. So if you don't want to miss all the action that will be coming out on the channel over the coming months as we prepare for 2025 Roth IRA conversions, plus the implementation of all the inbound tax law changes that are coming our way, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that notifications button, and I will see you in the next video.